What's up, U.S. history? Okay, shifting gears here a little bit. If you remember, I told you to start 2 pages of notes up for quarter four, and we're really going to be covering events that are happening like in the Cold War and in the Civil Rights Movement that were all kind of unfolding simultaneously at the same time. But they're, of course, one's dealing with like foreign policy stuff, the other is like domestic policy or the home front. So they're sometimes they overlap and are like interrelated. Other times they're very separate and kind of isolated. Anyway, I know we've been hitting a lot of Cold War stuff kind of through this week, but today shifting gears a little bit because we're covering some things that were happening early in like the Kennedy presidency, but now we're going to take a look at what was going on in the home front with kind of the racial tensions that had been building for a while. Now, the civil rights movement starts up in the 1950s, but in the 1960s, that's when it really gets rolling and things very much heat up. So what we've covered on the civil rights notes so far, we'd hit like Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier in baseball. That's in like the late 1940s, right after World War II. Then we get the Brown versus Board of Education decision that said you can't have black schools and white schools, just public schools, and they're going to be integrated where blacks and whites could go in the same classrooms, in the same buildings. That raised tensions a lot when that happened in 1954. Then about a year later, Emmett Till, that black boy from Chicago that was down visiting family in Mississippi. He is horribly lynched, and then there is a just kind of a sham trial that happens afterwards, where the two guys that were clearly guilty of that horrific murder totally get off scot-free. That's kind of the spark that gets things rolling. A few months after that, you have Martin Luther King leading his first major civil rights protest where he starts to become a national figure. That's where Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat and they do the Montgomery bus boycott. So that's all happening kind of right through to the end of the 1950s. Now when you get to 1960 and that the new election has happened, you have a president in Kennedy who has tried to appeal to black voters, where remember black voters primarily had voted. You go back a couple decades before, they had voted overwhelmingly Republican because Lincoln was a Republican, and the Confederate states, those were like the Southern Democrats. So historically, blacks had identified more with the Republican Party. That started to shift through basically the Great Depression and World War II years. FDR was tried to appeal to the black community, and then by the time Kennedy runs in 1960, that's the first time that the black community, a majority of them vote for a Democrat for president. All right. So things are changing. And now we don't have Eisenhower as president anymore, who was a law-abiding guy. He was a steady hand at the wheel and kind of kept the country moving ahead. But he was no big fan of the civil rights movement, and he definitely was not a progressive that was trying to shake things up. But Kennedy had promised to do that. So I think that gives a lot of hope and inspiration to people across the country, whites and especially blacks and leaders in the black community, that now with new political leadership there and a younger face that's running the executive branch, that, hey, maybe now we can really start getting things done. Now, remember, Martin Luther King, who had led the Montgomery bus boycott, and he is becoming a very nationally renowned figure by the time you hit 1960. Sometimes people think that he is like the leader of the civil rights movement. I guess if I had to pick one person that I essentially would say is the leader, I'd probably throw him up there. But understand that this is a massive movement that's taking place across the country. There are dozens, if not even hundreds, of different people that are in leadership roles. And average people are stepping up and going to take a stand. And, so it's not like it's a country or a military type organization where there is one, like a clear-cut chain of command. Now, Martin Luther King is the most well-known of the civil rights leaders, but he certainly is not the only one. The two protests that I'm going to hit today are different styles of protests, and actually, Martin Luther King had nothing to do with getting these protests running, the two that I'm covering today. However, he was very, very supportive of them, and he talked to some of the people that were practicing these style of protests, and he said, I'm on board with it 100%. He encouraged it. He tried to put good press on it. And remember, to the core of who Martin Luther King was, he wanted peaceful protest, because I think he very wisely realized that to get any meaningful change in America, you don't have to win over every single white person in the country, but whites are a majority, and you have to win a chunk of white America over that are going to be sympathetic to the plight of the Black community to really get meaningful changes. And he knows that the best way to do that is not by rioting and fighting back and like picking up arms and trying to fight the government or something, that's going to create a huge backlash. That's going to make the civil rights protesters look like troublemakers. But if you do peaceful protests, and no matter what, you're always peaceful. Remember, we call it civil disobedience. You're refusing to obey unjust laws, but you're doing it in a peaceful way. That's the best way to get more people sympathetic to what you have going on. In both of these two protests that I'm covering today, these two styles, absolutely fall into the category of civil disobedience and are Martin Luther King style peaceful protests. Both of these will be on upcoming quizzes, and they for sure, I'll have an exam question on each of these styles of protest. So the first one that I have for you, and it originally starts up in Nashville, actually, like the video I chose for you today, it highlights it happening in Greensboro, North Carolina. Bottom line, I want you to know the sit-in style of protest. So that's what you'd want to write down. I'd put a little heading for that peaceful protest, and then like sit in, you know what I mean? Or put it in parentheses or something so it stands out to you. That this style of protest really catches on and becomes a popular form of peaceful protest across the southern states. Now, what essentially is a sit-in protest? Well, lunch counters and restaurants across the South were segregated, just like schools and buses had been. Now, the Supreme Court has said by the end of the 1950s, schools, buses, you can't have segregation in those anymore. But restaurants or your local diner, those are privately owned businesses. And at this point, it was still kind of like, well, you know, the business owner, whoever owns it and runs and operates that establishment, they can have any seating policy they want. Now, it's still kind of nonsense, right, to segregate your restaurant up based on race, but that's how Southern society was. So typically, what was very common, and of course, every restaurant, every state might be slightly different, but the standard policy was that, you know, like white guests can come in and eat at the counter. And let me move my face here so you can see that image a little better too. White people could come in and eat at the counter, eat at the tables. Some restaurants would have like a colored section. That was the terminology that was used back then, where maybe blacks could go sit in the back corner. But a lot of these restaurants would still serve black people. They wanted to get money. You know, it's a business. But black people would have to go around to the back of the restaurant, place their order. They'd pick it up there, and it was basically like dine out only. It's kind of crap, right? I mean, what a sucky policy. In today's mind, it's like, man, it's kind of mind-boggling that's the way things were running. But anyway, for a sit-in protest, now here's what I'd want you to have, like what it is and what it means if you ever hear of a sit-in. It was, you would go to a segregated establishment to eat, a segregated diner, and knowing that the policy was that, like, if you're a black person, that you're not allowed to go eat up at the counter, you would just go sit peacefully up at the counter and wait to be served. Now, typically, the restaurant, the cook, the manager, whoever would come and say, "You're not allowed to be there. You're colored. You got to go around back if you want food." You weren't supposed to get into a big confrontation or yell or scream or throw anything, but you basically, the protest is you're going to sit there and wait to be served, knowing that they're never going to serve you, and you're going to basically sit there all day. You're going to sit there for hours and hours. You're taking up spots on the counter. You're making a point with it. So I believe I thought it started in Nashville, although the video that I chose for you today goes all into events that were happening in Greensboro, North Carolina. Bottom line, I'm not going to quiz you on where it started at or any of the particular cities. What I do want you to know is the style of protest, and that it was blacks would go in, sit at a segregated counter, and wait to be served. it starts to become more controversial. It seems like a very innocuous, kind of peaceful, benign style of protest that's not very threatening. However, there's a big backlash to it once it starts catching on. Also, another thing, and I like this photo that I have right below my face here. This is a really famous sit-in protest photograph. That ran across the country. Sometimes you would have, it was also seen as inappropriate to have whites and blacks kind of intermingling, right? The policy down south was segregation, dividing up by races, not integration. But a lot of white people were sympathetic to what was going on, and they felt like it was BS and nonsense. So you did have a lot of sympathetic white people that would come and protest alongside other people of color. And like in the photo that you have right below me here, it was where two whites and at least one black lady in this one, but I think there are a couple more that are off the camera here, went and sat down together kind of in an integrated fashion. And then the whole crowd behind them, you can see, not a very popular thing to do if you were down in the deep south in a rigidly segregated city, and you have that crowd behind them, like not necessarily beating them up and punching them and physically doing a lot of harm to them, but totally trying to humiliate them, yelling at them. You can just imagine what that crowd is screaming at the white and black people that are up there sitting together doing this sit-in protest. But they're also coming up and dumping beverages and plates of food all over them and just making them a mess. Anyway, if you're a person like Michigan was not a segregated state, say you were up in Michigan and reading the newspaper or watching the evening news, and you see images like this, like, man, they're just going in and trying to eat, and you have all of these people gathering behind them screaming, a picture's worth 1,000 words, right? Um, Photos like this running in the western states that are not segregated, or in the northern states like Michigan that are not segregated, this does a lot to impact the attitudes of average small town white people across the country who just look at images like that and say, man, what the hell is going on down south? And there starts to become a backlash to all of the segregationists. Okay. Sit-in protest is the first one. The next one I want you to have, one other very famous style of protest, and this one's actually had quite a few movies made about it, would be the freedom rides. Or sometimes you hear them called like the freedom riders. Okay. So bus segregation was struck down. However, that just because the Supreme Court passes down a court ruling does not mean that like everybody all around the country gets on board with it immediately. In a lot of those southern states, even though technically it was illegal, they were still running their bus lines and a whole number of services in a segregated fashion. So on most of these bus lines down south, kind of the Jim Crow South, blacks were supposed to be in the back of the bus. Certain buses were like whites only, but definitely blacks and whites were not supposed to be in the same seats riding together. Well, freedom riders, kind of the whole point of this style of protest is it needs to be integrated. So one of the things I like about the freedom ride style protest is, well, first, it's peaceful and it's civil disobedience where you're not obeying a crappy law, but you're doing it in a peaceful way. Also, you can see this is totally, even though Martin Luther King didn't like initiate these, it was actually a guy named James Farmer, who's another really interesting civil rights leader. It's totally in that Martin Luther King mindset where you're going to get blacks and whites working together to gain sympathy. So in all the freedom ride protests, you'll see blacks and whites working collectively, like the photo I have above me here, where several white people, several black people are all kind of mixed in together. And essentially, how these would work, you would buy a bus ticket going from one town to another, and you would sit through the whole bus where it's like a bus seat where there's like two people on this seat on the side and two on this, and it would be white black the whole way. So you're totally integrated and you're all mixed together. Initially, this didn't make too big of a splash. I think the first time or two it happened, because a lot of people are oblivious to it. You can't see it happening on the bus unless you're on the bus or know it's happening. But it increases in like popularity and it becomes a national news story. And when that happens, then you have a lot of people that are freedom riders that are doing this all over the South, just kind of provoking a reaction essentially. And you see a backlash where angry crowds start to turn out and get violent. Like the bus, I have the photo down here where like Molotov cocktails were thrown at that bus and burned it. Quite a few of the Freedom Riders actually like had violence, they had violent things happen to them and got beat up, and a handful too were murdered. There was a couple very, I don't know, high profile cases where blacks and whites both got murdered by the KKK, essentially catching up with them, tracking them down when they were getting off the bus, and then got them afterwards. So anyway, some of these do turn violent, but it's not the Freedom Riders that are doing the violence. It's the angry crowds, the old school traditional people down south that don't want an integrated society, kind of have a backlash against them and fight them over this. Now, I have 2 additional videos today, maybe actually 3 or 4 that I'm throwing in there, but I essentially want you to watch one at least on the sit-in protest, and I want you to watch one that I chose on the Freedom Riders. I don't care which ones. I'm putting a little variety up there because, like I said, a lot of people participated in both sit-ins and Freedom Rides. So it's not like there's just one right story for you to hear. There's a lot of different stories because a lot of people participated in these. So check out a couple of the videos that I have attached. Make sure you at least watch one all the way through on sit-ins and one all the way through on Freedom Riders. And of course, if you want, go YouTube it, go Google it on your own and look it up. There is a plethora, an abundance of information about both of these style protests. So you go do some digging in on your own, but make sure you have both of these styles of protests accounted for in your notes with good common sense definitions to them, because I can promise you both of these will end up being an exam question down the road. If you have any questions for me, hit me up and let me know, and I'm happy to chat with you a little more on it. Take care.